To give you a brief background, I was fully trained as a football player in my home country of Sweden, as Franz Beckenbauer of my country. I was unfortunately too slow, so that's the reason I was then moving on to surgery. So I'm a fully trained surgeon, a urologist. I realized very early that research is essential, so I moved on to laboratories doing basic translational research. I was spending a number of years in the United States in the 90s. At that time, absolutely the #1 country in the world in terms of the research, especially cancer research. Now I am not only a urologist, but also a network builder. I think most people recognize me doing that at present time, bringing the urological community together to do the best for our patients. And I think what I will do is to go through a number of slides very quickly, because we're running out of time, as you said, Marisa. So let's start with my organization. Of course, it's not an organization per se only for urologists. We are actually there to train urologists to do the best for our patients and their families. So move on quickly, please. So we are doing a lot of research science, and I will get back to it in a moment. And we are not only covering Europe by definition, we are actually having members covering all world parts of the world, including Middle East, Iran, India, now China, Brazil, Mexico, and so forth. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do is to support basic, as I said earlier, translation and in the end, clinical trials and clinical research. We have more than 15,000 members at present time. We provide our urologists in training with scholarship, fellowships, and so forth, in order to improve diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment of our malignant disorders, cancer especially. And we are covering, in other words, more than 1/3 of all cancers in Europe, actually. And I will get into some details in a moment. Next slide. So if you look here, what we define as uro-oncological cancer, of course, the most prominent one is prostate cancer, being the #1 cancer in the male population in Europe and in the Western world. Then we continue with bladder cancer, and we also cover kidney and in the end testicular and penile cancer, being rather rare. But please remember, testicular cancer is the most common malignant disease in young males. Next slide. If you look at, next slide, please. We can continue to press the button here. How many cases we estimate per year being diagnosed with urological disorders. You find, of course, prostate cancer in the top, followed by bladder and so forth. You continue to press all the time. Press the button, please. Next one. And then in females as well, kidney and renal cancer. I think when it comes to mortality, once again, prostate cancer is the second leading cause of death in the male population. Next slide. If you look at bladder cancer, I think this is a typical example how what is going on, because there is an increase in incidence. In other words, the number of cases being diagnosed with bladder cancer is increasing, not in the male population, but rather the female population. And the reason for that is, one, smoking, because the young ladies are actually in the habit of smoking more and more. So this is a typical example how you can prevent cancer, especially bladder cancer in males and females. Next slide, please. When it comes to prevention, it was discussed thoroughly previously by several speakers. If you look at this saying here, you can read it, of course, if you understand Chinese. This is an old, we continue to press the button. If you look here, superior doctors, of course, prevent the disease. I think that's the way to move forward. Mediocre doctors treat the disease before evident. The final one is, of course, inferior doctors treat the full-blown disease, and that is a typical example of how we treat most of our patients, unfortunately. Next slide, please. And that was actually said 1,000 years ago in China. So when you look at prostate cancer as an example how to prevent the disease, we know quite a lot when it comes to dietary measures, but there are certain risk factors. In other words, if you push again, I think you know that there are many risk factors actually listed, not only in terms of prostate cancer, but also colorectal cancer, breast cancer, so forth. They're pretty much the same. You should live as a Chinese, as they did historically. Unfortunately, they're more into American habits now with McBurgers or McDonald's and so forth. So this is the way to prevent, but unfortunately we lack a lot of randomized trials and evidence actually in terms of level A and so forth. Next slide. So when it comes to how to prevent, for instance, prostate cancer, continue with the next one. There's a lot on the internet, and you can easily be lost as a patient when you're out there, because we know for sure, of course, low-fat diet would be excellent. Exercise, we know for sure. However, we have launched a number of trials looking at vitamin E and selenium and so forth. It didn't prove to be of a major difference. Statins is something very interesting, not only in terms of preventing cardiovascular disorders, but also cancer in general, including prostate cancer. And then there are a number of drugs now being tested in randomized fashion, looking very, very promising, but still not accepted in the urological and oncological community. Next slide, please. So looking at this, I think the debate about screening is essential, because we cannot prevent prostate cancer as a whole, unfortunately. I would love to see that happen. So screening, you've seen all over the place being debated in terms of prostate cancer. Next slide, please. And there is a randomized screening trial, next slide, actually launched in Europe by Louis Denis and Fritz Schröder, giving us an typical example of what you can actually achieve by screening. But the problem is, if you look at this slide, next, push the next button, please. You will actually have a stage migration. You find cancer earlier and earlier. And of course, you can actually cure more and more patients. On the other hand, there is an absolute risk of overdiagnosis leading to overtreatment of prostate cancer. And that is pretty much the same with mammography and breast cancer. Next slide. So that is the problem we are discussing now in the scientific community. Next slide. So I think this data coming out, published in New England Journal of Medicine on the European randomized screening trial for prostate cancer, push the button, you showed clearly in this trial that you can decrease mortality if you start up screening for prostate cancer in the male population. Push the button all the time, please. However, the data was not really mature. So I think if you look, push the button, continue, 2 years onwards, we will have enough mature data that will show that we can decrease mortality enough to really discuss with our politicians in this parliament whether we should launch screening or mass screening for the male population in Europe. They did that actually 20 years ago in the United States. It was an anonymous decision in the Congress pretty much based on emotional arguments, not scientific arguments. Bob Doyle and other leading politicians in the United States were at that time diagnosed with prostate cancer, so it was entirely emotional decision taken. However, we have now at least some evidence in Europe that screening makes a difference in terms of mortality and morbidity. So push the button very quickly, because we don't need to go through all these points. We need to address the next coming 2 years in order to launch screening, whether that's going to fly or not here in the Parliament. So what we have created is a research foundation. It actually boils down to what we have discussed already today, but we have in our office trialist organization, we have basic researchers, we have a scholarship program and so forth, trying to integrate all our activities. And now we are in the process of integrating our activities with other organizations like medical oncologists, radiation oncologists in Europe, and other organizations, including EAU.wmv, here represented in this room today. So I think by saying, and now alluding to a previous speaker, we need to work together in order to make a difference, if we're going to make a difference in terms of morbidity and mortality of all those cancers. Next slide, please. So I think what does the future hold? That's clear. We need to put more effort into basic and clinical research for sure. Next slide, please. So we move on, please. And the next slide would be, please. This is the OMEC era. I think it was addressed very carefully and elegantly by Gordon McVie. I don't need to look at this in detail because it was addressed so nicely this morning. Next slide, please. So this is the anatomical lecture when I went to medical school and studied anatomy. In the future, it will be like this, as we heard from McVie earlier on. Next slide. And it's going to look very nice. Please, next one, like this. So this is really going to be the future. This is what we need to educate our urologists, medical oncologists, and so forth to learn and understand in the future. Otherwise, we won't be able to cure any type of cancer in the future. Next slide. So I think we have all the tools, actually, in terms of genomics and proteomics. Continue to push, please. We have a cookbook, we have ingredients, we have a dish, and in the end, we try to understand what it's all about when it comes to cancer. So we have all the tools, actually, how to identify new markers in order to really kill cancer. Next slide. So I think this is, next slide, integrating all this information we have in terms of omics, proteomics, genomics, and cell biology. This is absolutely the future, and the future is already here, ladies and gentlemen. Next slide. So this is a wonderful example. This is Lance Armstrong. He was diagnosed with metastatic testicular cancer many, many years ago, with brain metastasis to his lung, lymph nodes, and so forth. He was successfully treated with extensive surgery and a cocktail of chemotherapy. It was actually launched by two colleagues, and I learned to know them when I was working in the United States, John Donahue and his colleague in Indianapolis, because they were brave enough to combine extensive surgery with a cocktail of chemotherapy. And this guy was treated successfully. He's now cured. He won Tour de France 8 times. He has one child at least, and he's doing very well. The problem he has is mainly that he is suffering of too high levels of testosterone, but that's a totally different issue. But this is a wonderful example how you need private initiative too, in combination with money from the European Parliament to make a difference for our patients. Next slide. So this is actually testicular cancer, and this is something you should look at carefully, because this is Europe. Look at the difference, push the button all the time. Look at my country, Sweden, in the top, when it comes to how many patients dying of testicular cancer per year. And when the difference is made with Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and so forth, major difference. And this is not fair to those patients being diagnosed with testicular cancer in Eastern Europe versus the Scandinavian countries. It means that we have a wonderful program how to identify these patients, how to really treat them successfully. However, it's not used extensively in the rest of Europe. So that is something for the European Union to actually implement. Next slide, please. So what does the future hold? I think, next slide. The world population is aging. However, on the other hand, if you look at the medium age, of course, if you look at Europe, we have the highest medium age, and actually Sweden surpassed the Japanese a few years ago. Next slide. Time is relative, according to Albert Einstein, but for our patients, it's very, very essential. Please remember that. Next slide. So look at this. Of course, love is blind, but look at this now. We need money, and we don't only need money, we need brains. So that's the reason we have a network. Continue to push, please, and push. This is the way to make progress, like the Vikings did. We are actually conquering the world. What the Americans were very successful in doing during the 20th century, they brain-drained Europe. We should do the same. Bring them back to Europe. In other words, not only from North America, but we're doing now, we're having more and more Chinese students, Indian students, and Latin American students in our offices, in our laboratories doing research. This is what we need to do. We don't need to use the same approach as my former countrymen being Vikings, too aggressive, I would say. Next slide, please. So I think this is the end of my presentation, Marisa. Thank you very much for allowing me to come here and let us start working together, please.